Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
As we look back through much of the 20th century and really back through time, we discuss and have seen many different agencies and organizations that have been involved in the history of waterfowl management here in North America. One of the most widely known and influential agencies in that regard is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and their reach is felt throughout many different aspects of waterfowl management. From a habitat standpoint, without question, the most significant component of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to be the National Wildlife Refuge System. Now, we expect that all of our listeners here are familiar with the National Wildlife Refuge System, and many have likely either visited or hunted on refuges. And through those interactions, we suspect that you've kind of developed a few questions about the different activities that occur and then what role they play in the larger landscape. Today, we have joining us Dr. Heath Hagy, waterfowl ecologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wildlife Refuge System in the Southeast region, and he is going to give us an overview of the refuge system in that region with a particular focus on their role in supporting waterfowl populations. Heath, welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast.
Thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
You and I have known each other for quite a while. We both attended Mississippi State. You live nearby. We live about 10 minutes away from one another. So, we're happy to have you here and happy to get you to answer some of these questions and just talk about what you do and what the refuge system does in support of waterfowl management. And so to start with, give our folks some of your background. Let's hear about your personal and professional background, then let's transition to kind of what you do for the National Wildlife Refuge System.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I grew up in Oklahoma, so in the Central Flyway, and played some football at a small university in Oklahoma because I wasn't big enough to play at a big university. But that's all right. I made it through. Ended up going to North Dakota State for my master's, and then Mississippi State for my PhD. Then I've bounced around the Southeast and the Midwest for a few years, doing various roles, including being the director of the Forbes Biological Station at the Illinois Natural History Survey. Folks may be familiar with Frank Belrose of the Illinois Natural History Survey, and that was his station there in Illinois. In 2017, there was a new position created in the Southeast to have a waterfowl ecologist for the National Wildlife Refuge System, and I was fortunate to be able to get that role and was able to move down here with my family from Illinois, and now I cover the entire Southeast region, so Arkansas and Louisiana, all the way over to North Carolina, down to Florida, and including Kentucky. That's kind of the 10-state region that I cover. I work with National Wildlife Refuges to ensure that we have great habitat management for waterfowl and other wetland-dependent birds. So I'm sort of like an internal consultant, if you want to say that, to our biologists and our managers across the Southeast on our 131 National Wildlife Refuges in the Southeast.
131. I didn't realize it was that many. You sort of are a consultant advisor on waterfowl management issues on those as well. Now, this is a relatively unique position within the Fish and Wildlife Service, right? Do other regions have positions similar to yours?
Yeah, that is correct. Some of the other regions have similar positions, but I'm not aware that anybody has this exact position nested within the refuge system. In other regions, obviously the service, we do different things in different regions. So in other regions, we have some folks that may be in the Migratory Bird Program or maybe in the Inventory and Monitoring Program within refuges, and they may provide some technical assistance. But this position is a bit unique in that I'm within the refuge system, and I can work directly with our managers and our biologists on refuges to make sure that we do the most appropriate things where and when we need to for waterfowl to provide habitat.
From the perspective of the National Wildlife Refuge System, obviously we've kind of introduced here already and others have talked about, it really was started because of its importance for waterfowl habitat, right?
Correct.
And of course, we all know that waterfowl habitat management benefits a whole lot more than just ducks, geese, and swans. But how do you view the National Wildlife Refuge System nowadays in terms of its importance for supporting waterfowl populations? We know that waterfowl depend upon more than just public lands, right? They depend upon more than just federal lands. They depend upon private lands, the whole landscape, right? So how do y'all talk about within the service the way in which the refuge system and the properties that y'all have and that you manage fits within that larger landscape of habitat?
Mike, that's a great point. We are one component of sort of the wetland complexes that waterfowl are going to use across their annual cycle. For most of our dabbling ducks and our geese, even some things like sandhill cranes, we're going to provide the migration and winter habitat resources for those. So high energy foods, sanctuary, those kinds of resources are going to be important on many of our national wildlife refuges. During the breeding season, during the spring and summer, of course, wood ducks and some other cavity nesting birds will use some of our national wildlife refuges, and we of course manage for those. But the biggest component of our management is for those migrating and wintering birds here in the southeast. As you said, we're a component of a much larger landscape, and when we do our internal planning, we want to make sure that we recognize state WMAs, other federal lands potentially, and private lands too, in the amount of food and habitat resources they provide. And as you know, many waterfowl hunting clubs provide a lot of food on some of their areas. A lot of WMAs run by state agencies provide a lot of food, and so food is one component that we provide on refuges. But maybe one of the biggest things that we do that's a bit more unique than many states or many private lands is we provide sanctuary. So we provide areas where that are closed to hunting and are often closed to other public uses as well. And we even try to limit the amount of time that we spend in those areas during the winter so that the birds have a safe place to go and rest and feed and then and just sort of hang out and do any other life history sort of activities that they need to do, whether that be pair bonding or other sorts of things in the fall, winter, and early spring before they migrate back to the breeding grounds. So we try to provide that sanctuary, and we spread those sanctuaries out across the landscape so they're sort of hubs for those birds to use to go out and use other private lands. We expect the birds to move off of the refuges, go out and use food resources and use the habitat resources out on those private lands. So by sort of sprinkling refuges, National Wildlife Refuge across the landscape, we've created all these little hubs, or these stair steps. Originally is sort of what they were thought of, these stair steps that birds can use to use other parts of the landscape.
I knew we were going to get to a conversation about sanctuary in the National Wildlife Refuge System, and a lot of people have different opinions on that.
Sure.
A lot of different opinions on that. But you went there early on, so I'll just kind of follow up on that. You and I were at a meeting here recently, and we were talking about some ongoing research that y'all are supporting, and you're looking at how radio mark mallards, I believe it is, are using some of the areas around National Wildlife Refuges and on National Wildlife Refuges. And one part of that study deals with use of sanctuary versus open access areas. And I asked you a question about kind of what's the type of information that you're looking for, and how would you use this information to potentially change refuge management decisions. And you made you told me that it relates to how you would manage sanctuary. So kind of follow up on that, going back to what I asked you, is like, okay, if you do change, if this information tells you that if you understand better how birds are using the sanctuary, you might change your sanctuary configurations. Then my question to you was, well, so what's your objective there for changing that sanctuary configuration?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. So to reference a couple of the studies that you mentioned there, so we are involved with several universities that are conducting research using primarily mallards, but there's some other studies ongoing as well on other species. But here in West Tennessee, Tennessee and in eastern Arkansas, a couple of universities, Tennessee Tech and University of Arkansas at Monticello, have put out a bunch of GSM cellular transmitters on mallards, and that allows us to see how those birds use the landscape. How much time do they spend in sanctuary? How far do those birds move from sanctuary? And when do they move around? Do they change their movements? From early pre-hunting season time periods, or during the split between hunting seasons, or after hunting season? Do they change how much sanctuary they use? Do birds move between our sanctuaries? Do they hop around, or do they stay all at one area? And then what are survival and harvest rates that look like from our banded birds and our transmitted birds? So we have a whole lot of objectives. But with respect to sanctuary, one of the things that we're super excited to be learning is how much those birds move between our different sanctuaries, and if distance between those sanctuaries sort of matters. And so if you have two refuges that both have sanctuary and they're 10 miles apart, is there a higher chance that those birds will trade back and forth on a daily basis, or use one for a while and then in a week go use the other one, or are those fairly distinct and they sort of are holding their own distinct populations that then go and use the private lands and the WMAs around those sanctuaries? And so that research is ongoing. But what's interesting is that some of those data are really telling us that there is a lot of use of private lands next to those sanctuaries, and WMAs next to those sanctuaries during the hunting season. A lot of it comes at night, of course. Mallards are nocturnal foragers, and so they're going out and they're using corn or moist soil or rice or whatever around our refuges, but a lot of them are doing it at night, and that's super interesting. One of the reasons, as you alluded to, that we're interested in knowing all this is one of our objectives, of course, is public use. So not just public hunting and providing hunting opportunities on the refuge, but providing birds that are available for people to enjoy across the landscape. And so it's helpful to us to know, when birds are moving off the refuge and when they're moving on to private areas, so that they can be enjoyed by bird watchers, they can be enjoyed by duck hunters, and just the general public. And so collecting all of this information will help us as we try to acquire new lands. Where do we acquire them? What kind of habitat resources do we want to acquire? Rice fields, or do we want to acquire bottomland forest? And then how do we manage it? So all of this information that should be coming in the next couple of years from these large studies is going to really help us try to maximize our management, so that we not only provide good habitat for the birds, so that a number of them can go back to the north, but so they're also available for people to enjoy, both hunters and non-hunters.
So what do you say to the person that says, what do you mean you're providing sanctuary so that I can enjoy and have access to these birds? They're just always on the refuge and I never see them off the refuge. Isn't that the way it goes?
I'd say they need to look at some of our transmitter information, because I can promise you they spend a fair amount of time off the refuge, just at different times of the day. And of course, another thing we're looking at is what makes them move off the refuge, right? Is it cold? Is it weather? Do they naturally do it at different times of the year? So all of these interesting factors that some graduate students are going to pore over in the next couple of years.
I think that's a really good point. Of course, I made that comment, asked that question sort of jokingly, but it's important for people to know that the refuge systems has an objective for providing sanctuary, and it relates to ensuring public access and public use and appreciation of that resource. And all waterfowl hunters and anyone that has spent any time pursuing or watching waterfowl will know that sanctuary is important for giving birds a place to rest, a safe space to get away from some of the disturbance. And it certainly does play a role in this, in sort of a landscape scale effect. One of the more interesting things that you told me the other day is that the particular question of interest is the configuration of refuges, whether you need a single big sanctuary, a lot of small sanctuaries spread across the landscape, and how do those different configurations affect bird movements and opportunities for the public to view and have access to those birds.
Yeah, it's a great point. One of our biggest questions in the refuge system, and I think in the waterfowl management community as far as habitat management is concerned, is how much sanctuary do we need and what's sort of the juxtaposition of that sanctuary. So how many of those do we need? How big do they have to be? How close together do they have to be to achieve our objectives? And so that's one thing that we have very little data on. And so gathering all of this information through these transmitters, each transmitter can give us thousands and thousands of GPS points over during that winter period when a mallard is moving around the landscape. So that's going to allow us to look at their patterns of movement and see if there are any differences, and then tailor those to our objectives on refuges. So it is 100% a complex topic, and we're just beginning to get enough information to really be able to try to be a bit more strategic in how we think about sanctuary, trying to figure out how sanctuary really affects survival. How does it affect, overall fitness, birds going back and reproducing, so that we have another fall flight next year. So all of these things are sort of working together, but we're trying to get a handle on that. And the refuge system is I would say sort of at the forefront of that, working with universities to gather this information.
So let's move on now to a few of the other questions that I have, and I want to go back to something you said early on. In the Southeast region, 131 refuges.
Correct.
That have been kind of added gradually over the years. The first one was
1903. If
Pelican Island.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. 1903.
Yeah. And we continue to establish new refuges. It's not very common anymore, is it?
Yes, that's correct. So one of the most recent ones would be Green River. That's the most recent one in our region, which is in Kentucky, Kentucky's second National Wildlife Refuge.
That's only the second one in Kentucky. I didn't realize that. Yep. Wow, that's kind of surprising. And so again, just to clarify, as you've said, we are talking about the Southeast region. We could have a similar conversation with representatives from the Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge System and every other region. Do you have an idea of the acreage that's captured by those 131 refuges?
Ooh, I should know that, but I don't. It is millions of acres. I think of wetlands, we have something like 3 million wetland acres in the Southeast, and so we have certainly more than that in total acreage, but I don't know that off the top of my head.
Where I want to go now is to talk about how things have changed with regard to the acreage, the refuges. They were established and managed almost solely for the benefit of migratory birds, right? And I guess that probably still is one of the main priorities for refuges, right?
Correct, one of the main, but we have several other, and our several other priorities, and our mission has certainly diversified in the last 30 years.
So talk about that. How has it diversified, and what are some of the new priorities or expanding priorities for the refuge system?
Yeah, migratory birds is certainly one of our priorities in the Southeast. Threatened and endangered species, a very important priority that we have. And then public use and access has especially with the last administration, became a increasing priority for us. And so making sure that where it's compatible, that's another thing we have to consider. We have to make sure that any activity, management activity, public use is compatible with the refuge mission on our national wildlife refuges. And so that's an important consideration for us before we open an area up to kayaking or hunting or anything like that. We have to do an analysis and make sure that those are compatible, that it's not going to take away too much from one of those priority purposes that we have.
The determination of what is a priority for an individual refuge can be a complicated thing, can't it?
It absolutely can. And generally it's not that it can, it generally that it is a complicated thing. So the refuge system is super interesting if you dig into the history, because it's so complicated. So we mentioned the first National Wildlife Refuge went on the ground designated in 1903, and that's sort of the start of the refuge system. But we didn't call it the refuge system at that point. It took about 30 years, give or take, and there were properties being protected all across the U.S. By under various authorities in various ways, some paid for, some donated, just a whole sort of smattering, if you will, of different kinds of properties with different legislative action behind them or secretarial order, all sorts of ways that that these properties sort of congealed eventually into the National Wildlife Refuge System through a variety of laws.
And so when some of those refuges authorized or and brought into existence, is it always done through now a piece of legislation?
Much of the time, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So there are various ways that throughout our history that we've had National Wildlife Refuges sort of come to be. So it can be a legislative action. You can have secretarial orders. You can have somebody donate. You can have an executive order. So there are a variety of different ways that a National Wildlife Refuge over our history has been established and got their refuge purposes. So that's another thing. And some refuge purposes are very, very explicit. They're linked to a specific kind or a specific piece of legislation. Others are less specific, and they may, so one refuge may have refuge purposes that have been identified as, for wildlife conservation, for example. Another one may be very explicitly for waterfowl, wading birds, and other migratory birds, and everything in between, including things like for wetlands in general. And so when refuge managers are trying to determine what their priorities are, that's one of the first things that they go to is they go back. What are our purposes? What are our objectives? And what then sort of latitude do we have to work within those?
So when people visit multiple refuges across the country, across the region, and they see different types of habitat management, and they see areas where in their mind, they say, well, why isn't this managed in X way? Or why are we doing Y when this looks like it would be great for this? Or why aren't we doing more for waterfowl? Or why aren't we doing more for this T&E species that we know, threatened and endangered species that we know is present in this area? That's going to go back to, there's going to be some limitations, basically, so some constraints, some requirements that are built into some of the language that was associated with the establishment of those refuges.
100%. We have some refuges, especially some of our newer ones, that were designated specifically for an endangered species or a threatened species. We have other ones, especially some of the older ones, that are very, very broad. So the establishing language may be for wetlands and all wildlife, or some variation of that, and so that can lead to a lot of variation in how those properties are managed, and certainly they should be managed differently depending on where they are in the landscape and what priorities have been set for that refuge.
So let's talk a little about the role of National Wildlife Refuges in supporting waterfowl populations here in the Southeast region. And we've talked about sanctuary and how it fits within that, but what are some of the other ways in which, and priorities, I guess I might say, for the refuges in support of waterfowl populations, in the Southeast region? Breeding, non-breeding, where does that fall? What are some of the habitat management activities that are involved in that aspect of the refuge's role?
So what we do is we try to work with our conservation partners. So we talked about recognizing all of the private lands around us and the WMAs, our state partners, other federal partners, nonprofit organizations who may own land. And so we try to work with everyone around our refuges to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible with our management activities, so that we can stretch the dollars as far as possible for the birds. We do have a consistent set of objectives across the region. So every refuge now for waterfowl anyway, has a population objective, number of birds, which are sort of their goal to provide habitat for, and then that's translated into a foraging habitat objective. So an amount of food that those birds would consume over winter. Think about a big pile of calories. And so that's consistent with the way a lot of our migratory bird joint ventures also do large-scale conservation planning. And so so we can translate what we're doing into their large-scale conservation planning activities. So we talked about sanctuary earlier. That is important, but it's also pretty complicated, and sometimes we don't have as much latitude to change sanctuary as we might to change habitat management on the ground. And so that's why we went through a process a few years ago, established these population and foraging habitat objectives across all of our refuges that are important to waterfowl in the southeast, which is about 70. We have about 70 refuges, which we consider to be sort of important to waterfowl, have a lot of wetlands, have a lot of waterfowl that use them during the fall and winter. And so that's sort of the base of our planning activities for prioritizing what types of management we do. Now, sort of stepping down from those broad objectives that we have for each refuge, those foraging habitat objectives can be met in a large variety of ways. So we could use crops. We could use corn or rice or milo or millet, a variety of crops that we might plant. And we virtually all of our refuges that are important to waterfowl do moist soil management. So provide sort of seasonal wetlands that grow up with lots of wetland plants that produce a lot of seeds that are good for waterfowl. And we have lots of refuges that do that. So a variety of different combinations of crops and natural wetlands we use to meet those foraging habitat objectives.
So help me understand, or I'll ask you a question that I've heard people ask me on occasion, and you referenced it, the agricultural crops that are part of the refuges habitat management program. Mm-hmm. What's the history behind that? Mm-hmm. Why is it important? One of the things that I tell people is that the refuges, as you say, have identified goals for their contribution to regional waterfowl population and habitat objectives, right? Mm-hmm. And so they have certain goals that they need to meet. And they use those agricultural crops because they're high calorie mm-hmm. and they can be more efficient on their land, kind of given budget constraints, capacity constraints. Correct. Am I in the right ballpark with that answer?
100%. So we try to do as much quote unquote natural management as we can. Moist soil management, seasonal emergent marshes, bottomland hardwood forests that are flooded during winter, so forested wetlands. We try to maximize that on our refuges. But, as a proportion of the landscape, our refuges are an incredibly small proportion of the landscape. Even if you included all of our state partners with WMAs, we have an incredibly small portion of the landscape that we can manage, and we can make sure that there's enough food and area for an area to conduct their other activities that waterfowl need in the winter. And so crops, where they're appropriate, provide a huge bang for our bucks. You can get a big pile of energy for a limited amount of area compared to natural wetlands. Sometimes 15 to 20 times as much energy in some of our crops per unit area than some of our natural wetlands. And so what we generally try to do on most of our refuges where we have these large goals and we can't meet those just with moist soil vegetation or just with bottomland hardwood forest, then we try to supplement that with agriculture to make sure we provide enough food resources for a portion of the birds that are in a region. There's an important caveat there, and that's what I said, a portion of the birds that are in a region. So we don't plan to take care of all of the birds in West Tennessee on our wildlife refuges. We plan to take care of a small portion of those. And the same thing in Arkansas, same thing in Florida, North Carolina, so on and so forth. So we build that into our planning process. We talk to our state partners, what proportion of the birds that come here do you think you can take care of? What proportion do you think that private lands provides food for? And so we sort of have that conversation. We go through a process, and then we land on sort of our contribution. So even though we do produce crops in the southeast on our refuges, we are only contributing to a small portion of the energetic needs of most waterfowl throughout the area. We're depending on private lands. We're depending on our state partners to provide the rest of that energy.
And the National Wildlife Refuge System looks to not only the state partners, but other partners through the joint venture, the Migratory Bird joint ventures that were established by the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. We've had some mm-hmm. people on previously to discuss those. That's the larger partnership framework under which those conversations occur, right?
100%.
And the conservation planning that the joint ventures do is kind of replicated by you at the local, more regional scale around your refuges, correct?
That's correct. Yep. Yeah, we try to work down from those joint venture objectives where they exist, and make sure that on a more localized basis, we have an idea of what we should and can contribute around our refuges.
So we're trying to paint a picture here for folks to understand that the refuges don't work in isolation from
Absolutely
all their state and other private land partners. And the joint ventures provide, as I said, that framework through which those conversations and that collaborative planning occurs. And that's one of the key roles of your position, right? To help facilitate that process and achieve some consistency in how that process occurs, because the Southeast region is intersected by multiple joint ventures, and there's slight deviations, slight differences in how the planning occurs across those joint ventures. Nothing too fundamentally different, but there's some small differences. How's that gone for you? What's been your experience over the past few years trying to achieve that level of consistent planning, or more consistent planning and coordination? Because the refuges have seen resource constraints, budget cuts, the whole issue of complexing of refuges now. It used to all be, or most, maybe all individual refuges, but here in more recent times, you now have complexes of refuges as a way of consolidating capacity under reduced budgets. So they're facing a lot of challenges. So how have things gone for you here over the past few years?
It's always exciting, and it's always a longer conversation than you think it's going to be in the beginning. But I think that's okay. It's a good thing. I'll chance a guess here. I think there are 6 migratory bird joint ventures that overlap the Southeast region. That's at least close to reality. And so working with all of those joint ventures, working with where they are in their planning processes, they're all in a little different place in their planning processes. Even if they use similar planning processes, they're generally not going to be the same. The units, the crosswalk can be a little bit different, and so that's something that has kept me busy over the last few years is trying to have a consistent set of objectives for refuges that can work within and be complementary to, as much as possible, all those different planning processes for waterfowl. Because at the end of the day, it's important that we all do this together, and that and our joint venture partners, or through those partnerships, they're super helpful in letting us know or helping us determine what our contributions to the landscape are and should be relative to private lands, WMAs, and other things. That's too big for us to figure out, for me to sit and figure out on my own. And so I depend on our partners, some of them in state agencies, some of them in the Fish and Wildlife Service, some of them in NGOs like Ducks Unlimited. So super important are those partnerships for our planning on national wildlife refuges.
Have you had other regions of the Fish and Wildlife Service inquire about your position, the nature of your position? Is there, because as we said at the start, it's a new position, and is it a joint position, jointly supported by the Refuge System and Division of Migratory Birds? Is that correct?
My position is nested in Refuges currently, but to your question, yes. I often talk with other regions. I'm not sure if they're considering any position like mine, but as I mentioned earlier, there are some other regions that have people that do what I do. It just may be nested in several other positions. It may be spread out across programs. Some people may do some of the planning in migratory birds, or they may nest that in their inventory monitoring program. And so there generally are people doing similar things in other regions. It's just a little bit less consolidated in a single position from my experience. I often work with people in other regions. So Fish and Wildlife Speak or whatever. We have Region 3, which is sort of the Midwest. That's our Legacy Region 3. We have Legacy Region 2, which is the Southwest, Oklahoma, Texas, and other states. And I often work with those other regions on things that are helpful and beneficial to both of us, like crop yield assessments, for instance, or wood duck banding goals, things like that. There are many things that, of course, we're talking about migratory birds here, so they cross our regions every year, and so we have to work together. And so a big part of my position is coordinating with what's going on in other regions and making sure, as much as possible, that what we do is complementary for what those birds need up and down the migratory bird flyways.
Heath, this has been a great conversation. I've had other questions come to my mind that I could ask you about. I know you get out and do some wood duck banding, some Canada goose banding. You are involved in a lot of different research projects here in the Southeast and probably farther, and probably even still involved in some in the Midwest. I know you work there, as you mentioned earlier. But we're going to have to wrap this up. I guess in closing, what are some of the most significant challenges that you see for National Wildlife Refuges relative to waterfowl management here going forward?
It's a great question. You mentioned one earlier, budget constraints and consolidation. That's not unique to the refuge system. It's not unique to federal government. A lot of agencies have had shrinkages, and I'm not going to advocate one way or the other for budgetary items. We certainly have had our mission broadened in the refuge system, and I think that's good. It's not just about waterfowl. It's not just about wading birds. It's not just about endangered species. It's not just about recreation and giving people access to the outdoors or environmental education. It's about all of those things and more. And so that broadened mission with increasing human populations, increasing threats to the landscape, all of those factors put more and more of a strain on our refuge staff to do the job that we've done for 75 years or so now in the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so all sorts of things are sort of vying for our time and our refuge managers' time. So if you go to a National Wildlife Refuge and the grass hadn't been mowed around the office in a few days, it may be that one person has 20,000 acres to worry about. And so give us a little grace. But we do want you to come out. We do want you to enjoy our National Wildlife Refuges. It's a pleasure to talk to folks as they come and they view our birds or they enjoy our recreational opportunities that we offer. So we do want that. We want people to come enjoy them.
Thank you for joining us here, Heath. It's been a great conversation, and we're going to catch up with you on a few other topics here later on.
Thanks, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Heath Hagy, waterfowl ecologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Wildlife Refuge System in the Southeast region. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for producing the podcast and getting them out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and spending it with us and for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.